but is a great way to share space today with everybody around the world. So thank you again. We are having a phenomenal conversation today on cultural responses to common dilemmas. So we are all in this human experience together, and though we live in different areas of the world, some cases, you know, we need a couple different resources to be able to weather the experience, if you will. And so this is a really exciting conversation to see where we're similar and where we're different and how we can learn from each other. Again, as human beings, we commonly have dilemmas, and this session is going to discuss a range of human imperatives, dilemmas, paradoxes, contradictions, and polarities, which is one of my favorite things. With us today, we have two authors that I'm going to pass over and have them introduce themselves because I fear I will not do it justice. Steve, good evening.
Good evening.
Tell us a little bit about yourself, and thank you for being here.
Thank you, Vanessa. Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us and being part of this session, and really grateful for you wishing to spend the next 90 minutes with both Fons and I. We are delighted. In terms of my own background, I've had a corporate career of over 35 years, of which 5 years has been in as an executive coach and as a consultant. I've worked for several multinationals and professional-led Indian organizations, both in India and across outside India as well, and across a whole range of sectors. So that's my background. I've recently, about 2 weeks old, published a book, which is The Indian Boss at Work, Thinking Global, Acting Indian. And unlike Fons, who's probably published over 25 books. And with that, Fons, your turn next.
Thank you so much, Steve. Yes, I needed a lot of space to get my ideas across. But it's wonderful to be here. I very often start by saying that I was born out of a French mother and a Dutch father, which for those who know Europe a bit doesn't make you Belgian. But it's wonderful to be born out of a multicultural family. And I'm saying that because it gives you early signals of how important it is to deal with different viewpoints and also the dilemmas that create. Anyway, I finished my economics degree, which in the Netherlands is kind of broad, but I focused on organizational behavior. Immediately thereafter, I did a PhD at Wharton on looking at, and I'm talking about early 80s, 81, 82. My PhD on how does national culture affect corporate culture. And believe me, people were looking at me if I was a complete nut, because culture, who cares? You know, it's the Anglo-Saxon model that will make you rich and forget the rest. And joined Shell, the Royal Dutch Shell Energy Company, for 9 years, applying my PhD work, and then started consulting and training in the area, and always trying to do evidence-based consulting. In other words, everything we did was based on research. And the latest one, and I hope we can say something more about it later, was on the COVID-19 crisis and talking about dilemmas. Dilemmas are very much the result of the Corona crisis. And I would like to apply, like we did in the research, how culture gives us the same dilemmas, but the approach to resolving them are quite cultural. The big one obviously being the economy versus health. Some cultures have decided to start with economy and are shocked by the health results. Some started with health and are shocked by the economic results. And those countries who have combined the two, namely see some economic benefit in dealing with health, they come out much better than the other countries. And I will dwell on that a bit more as examples. And also, hopefully, Steve, you will go into what does that mean in dealing with people from India.
Sure. Super. So thanks for that, Fons. And I think just in terms of laying out the roadmap over the next 80 minutes and so, we obviously would like to unpack the theme itself around what exactly do we mean by dilemmas? What is it that we mean by the term culture, and therefore the response culturally to dilemmas? And then really try and unpack some of the lenses that Fons has developed over several years now of a way of looking at the cultural lenses around dilemmas and how societies, cultures tend to respond to it. And I will try and bring in some of the responses that come from an indigenous background pertaining to India itself. We obviously also want to move towards how could we possibly look at mitigating, resolving dilemmas. And initially, as we set up the conversation, we're inviting you to do put in your questions on the chat box, avoid the Q&A, put everything up in the chat box so we have one screen to look at. And we will respond to your questions, perhaps more of questions towards the end, but at some point in between, we'll pause and pick some of the questions that is interesting and would enhance the point. Is there anything else, Fons, you think we should also share to clarify what we're going to be doing over the next 85 minutes?
No, I think you said it very nicely. It would be lovely to at least have a language, what we mean with culture. There are so many definitions. I remember when I was doing my PhD, and that is more than 35 years ago, it was interesting to see a little booklet by Kluckhohn and Kroeber. And I forgot the title, but the subtitle was The 250 Definitions of Culture. And so you can look at culture from a variety of aspects. I happen to love the work of Ed Schein, who was, by the way,
last evening, yes.
The same group yesterday evening. And what a wonderful guy. And so we have taken that model of culture, and we'll explain that a bit more in detail in a second. And then indeed go through our cultural model, and I'll give explanations in how that manifests itself in general, but also in the COVID-19 fight. And then I'll give the word to you, Steve, to take that way of looking at it and apply it to what does that mean in India in general, and perhaps with an Indian boss in particular.
Thank you, Fons. And before we start to talk, Fons, I'd like to invite all of the participants on this session to respond to this question on the chat box. And the question that is there for you is, based on your lived experience, not on your thinking and the theory of it, but based on your actual lived experience, do you believe that all human beings are similar or distinctive? And just type in D, capital D or capital S, and take a position on the chat box. And we'll pause while you type that in. So we've got a couple of Ds, we've got one S. Fons, you can see the screen. Somebody has put a D and an S.
Yeah, I like that.
Somebody has put both again. If I can follow the screen, we probably have 60-40, I think, or maybe 70-30 to the Ds, with S being about 25 and both being about 5%. Do you have a comment on the Ds and the S? Someone says my response is for both. Okay. Fons, any comment? I have done this. Yeah, go ahead.
With these difficult questions, it's always best to use a metaphor. If we take our human body and we look at our human body worldwide, I think most people have one head, two arms, two legs, right? But if you say, what about the color of the skin, or what about gender, you see that they're distinctive, yeah? And we can even go into details, the color of the eyes and what have you. So I think the real answer is, yeah, on some levels of abstraction, they're very, very similar. And on other levels, they're very distinctive. And I think that is true for other aspects of humanity too.
And when I think about the responses that we've got today, and I've done a few webinars, about 15, 16 of them, the pattern seems to be similar, with the movement more towards D and less towards S. And some, of course, have provided answers. So it's very similar in terms of what we are seeing here with what I've seen elsewhere. And my own response to this question is that the challenges and the imperatives that all human beings face are universally the same. But the way a culture or perhaps a country respond to those universal imperatives vary because of what I use a term called the Kal, Desh, and the Patra, or what is the region that it creates the context for the thinking, feeling, and behaving. And that's my view, and that's what I have seen, at least with respect to India.
Very, very nice, Steve. I fully subscribe to that.
So if we were to start with what we've promised, Fons, could you clarify the notion of dilemma as you hold it? What is a dilemma according to you?
Now, a dilemma, let's always start with the etymological root of the word. Dilemma comes from Greek, and it means literally two propositions. But in the context to which it's used, it means two propositions in conflict. And we have added the word apparent because there is hope with the dilemma, while perhaps there is not hope with the paradox. Now, this is a matter of how you define it. A paradox is an irreconcilable dilemma, and a dilemma has hope to be reconciled. Now, some other things that I need to say about dilemmas is very often it is two positives fighting. I say very often because it could be two negatives fighting. A dilemma is never a positive fighting with a negative, because then you just go for a positive. And that's an important point to make, because I've seen dilemma games that ended by, I hope that this game helps you to make a choice. Now, I have one golden rule. The worst you can do in a dilemma is to make a choice between the two propositions. Why? Because you lose the other half, okay? And global versus local, what is better? It's a stupid question. Local has advantages and disadvantages, and global has advantages and disadvantages. So it is a dilemma. Now, these are two positives. But if you say global consistency versus local chaos, that's not a dilemma, because global consistency, at least for some, is positive and local chaos is not. So that is important when we start with dilemma thinking. A final problem is people mixing a problem with a dilemma. Now, obviously, a problem is giving you the same feelings as a dilemma, but most problems can be solved by more time, more money, while a dilemma cannot. A dilemma needs another mindset. And those are the, so let me give you an example. If you say, what is the shortest way from JFK to Manhattan Center? Then you say, oh, that's the shortest way really is straight over the traffic jams. Can you imagine a country with the money of America being in a traffic jam from JFK to Manhattan all the time? Anyway, there was a footnote. But a helicopter would be the best solution, right? I
Mm.
say, oh yeah, helicopter, it's very expensive. Now, what is the cheapest way and the shortest way? Then you say, yeah, but if you want to be the cheapest, then you should walk. But then it's not the shortest way. So the point here is it becomes a dilemma. So a problem is solved by more money. You know, you take the helicopter and that's the shortest way. At the moment you say the shortest and cheapest way, then you get a dilemma. And that is something that we need to keep in mind. By the way, if you take global versus local as an example, if you are, because the point I'm trying to make, not everything is a dilemma, is if you are going to a marketing or an HR person, then you say, yeah, but what works in America will not work in Singapore or in Japan. So local is different, but we are an international firm. We need standardization because people move from Singapore to Japan, from Japan to America. And the point I'm trying to make is for marketing and HR people, it's a dilemma. We need and standardization because people move, and we need to go to the local circumstances. But if you are in safety management and you say, I am head of safety for the refinery in Singapore, the refinery in Tokyo, and the refinery in Philadelphia, then you might say, I don't want local destructions. Everything needs to be standardized because it's about safety. So you see that even on the level of global and local, it depends in what area you are to call it either a problem or a dilemma. Let me stop here. Obviously, there might be many more discussions, but we'll go through a lot of examples of that nature.
Fabulous. So, Fons, I was struck with the word you said, apparent, and also distinguishing between dilemma and a problem. And I think from my perspective, as I think about it, dilemmas and contradictions and polarities and paradoxes is an inevitable process of living and dealing with life's imperatives and so on. There's constantly going to be a pull and a push, and therefore it's an inevitable element that we have to deal with. And like you said, a dilemma is really appears like an either-or situation, and it's almost like damned if I do, damned if I don't, and therefore looking for a third alternative, which is really not a compromise, but looking for a third alternative to hold it together.
Yes.
But if I were to cut through the world of dilemma and look at certain things like polarities, for instance, then I would say that polarity is nothing but a foreground and a background. That I am essentially, working in a Western stage with the masculine principles, and yet I have inherently an Indian spirit that is, a polarity, or that there is a polarity between masculine and feminine principles and energies, and one seems to be more dominant than the other. And it's not as if it's a choice of either or, but it's really about the salience or the amplification of the multiplicity of both inherent in that particular bucket is one strata of how I see the polarity. And the third is the paradox. For example, we have tremendous amount of paradoxes in India, one of them being that we are united in our diversity. And someone would say, how can that be? That your multiplicity actually unites you as a country. I think a paradox is to be able to transcend between the shifting of a dilemma of either or, but to transcend and look at it from a different paradigm that allows you to resolve the situation. And therefore, I think why I'm perhaps clarifying this is the way one looks at polarity or dilemmas or paradoxes then allows you to look at stances that we take, because they're not problems, as you said, Fons, but they're actually mental models in the way in which one comes at these three elements. And I was
Very much so,
Hmm?
Steve. Perhaps a beautiful picture, which I will make sure you get a copy of. But since we haven't done this for 5 times, it's a picture where
Yeah.
you have a square
Mm-hmm.
and you have an ellipse.
Mm-hmm.
And most of our models, including cultural models, say, are you German? Oh, that's a square. Are you Italian? Oh, that's an ellipse. Yeah. And the models even measure you, how much are you a square and how much you are an ellipse, right? And then suddenly you say, but think about a cylinder on which you shed lights from a different side. Now, if you share the light from the top, you get as a shadow an ellipse. And if you share light from the side of the ellipse, you get a square. So suddenly you realize, hey, there is a reality out there, depending on how you shed the light, which gives you a mirror image of the ellipse, of the cylinder in completely different ways. Now, this is a bit coming back to your first question. Are people similar or distinct? They are similar as an ellipse and they're distinct in their shadows. And the shadows are what I call cultures, and the ellipse, the cylinder is being human. And it depends on how you shed light. And there is another, let's say, Japanese story. And it was a story that I went through when I was in Tokyo about 20 years ago. I did a workshop and the Japanese were very nervous because there were a lot of Americans warning them that there was an Asian crisis, an Asian financial crisis imminent. The problem was Asians, but particularly the Japanese, they are too subjective. It's all about networks and people they know. And you need to be like we Americans, be more objective. And as you know, if the Japanese disagree or not understand, they say, hi, hi, hi. And if they do understand you, they say, hi, hi, hi. In fact, they always say, hi, hi, hi. And it was hi, 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 namely, I don't understand a damn what you're saying. So the Americans explained it again, but louder. You need to be more objective, hi, hi, hi. And they realized that when they asked the Americans to define objectivity, they didn't have a good word for it that captured it. And they came with the word kyakanteki that was closest to it, which literally means the outsider's viewpoint. So the outsider's viewpoint is objective. And the insider's viewpoint, shukanteki, is the word for subjectivity. And they came with, in our workshop, by the way, with HSBC, with 2 pictures, a square with bars, which looked like the top from a bridge. And they came with a trapezium. It was the side of the same bridge. And they say, hey, there are different ways of looking at the bridge. And then as a reconciliation, they showed the Japanese bridge in a Japanese garden. And they say, the Japanese garden is an invitation to connect viewpoints. Now, I thought this was so powerful, by the way, so did the advertising agency of HSBC, that they took that as a metaphor for throwing out their connectingviewpoints.com advertising campaign. I don't know if you recognize that. It was the most prize-winning advertising campaign ever, beautifully done. The point I'm trying to raise here is that the different viewpoints about the same object is especially insightful in showing that cultures are different ways of looking at the same thing. So we human beings are the same thing, looking at it differently. I hope that's helpful.
Yeah. And Fons, I was just listening to you, and one area that clearly gets amplified is about different cultures of different regions looking at the other, and obviously limited or strengthened with an ethnocentric kind of looking, which is peculiar and particularized to that kind of lens that is owned and legitimized in that culture. When I look at, for a moment, India in particular, because of our colonial past of 200 years and many other cultures that have come in through the 7,000 years, and in a corporate setting, we have seen British enterprises, and then we saw the Japanese enterprises, and then we saw the American enterprises. And we also recognized, though we didn't own it, that there was an Indian way of management that we hadn't legitimized. And we kept looking at messages that came from another. So there was a distinctiveness about how an organization came across, but there's also an Indian way in which seemed to suggest a way of working, a way of thinking, and a way of behaving. And what I wanted to actually pinpoint is that for a lot of Indians, there are a simultaneity of two cultures resident in a person, Fons. Mm-hmm. So a person is holding on to a postmodern, westernized world with masculine principles coming from the West. And because of the affluence of the West, therefore wishing to ape it and follow it. And at the same time, a 7,000-year-old social character, a Kal and a Desh, which is basically what Yuval Harari calls the dominant idea of the time, or Eric Fromm, in terms of social character, those permeating unconsciously or otherwise to create a clash between the culture within. So we are seeing a large number of titans holding one kind of leaning towards one culture in India and another with another kind of a culture. And those cultures also colliding within the context of the country itself, let alone the cross-cultural between countries and between regions.
Very, very nice. Very nice. Steve, what do you think of going to a little definition of culture?
Yes, absolutely.
And then really work out some of the dilemmas. And in the meantime, obviously, we'll look a bit at the questions asked, or Barry Johnson, I see, obviously.
Yes.
Wonderful way of looking at polarities.
Polarity matrix,
and the infinity loop, although we rather take the helix, because in the process of reconciliation, you learn and you go to higher levels. And I know that Barry Johnson goes beyond that too, but it's wonderful to note that we cannot have enough sources to do it well.
So let's jump straight into culture then. Back to you. Well, you've got lenses for culture. Yes.
Sure, because I know a lot of the people that are listening know the work of Ed Schein. I think Ed Schein has a very functional model of culture, multi-layered. On the outside, he calls it explicit culture. It's the expressions of culture, the way we dress, what we eat. But we might eat the same thing, like a hamburger or a sushi or whatever, tandoori chicken. But the reason why we eat it might be quite different. And then you come to a deeper layer of norms and values. So Americans might say, I take a hamburger because it's quick, it has enough stuff in it to survive. And the French say, as long as they don't see me entering McDonald's. And a Russian, I know, by the way, it's true, in the beginning, they say we buy it because it's American. And that's how it is.
Yeah.
Now, that shows that the expression of culture has a deeper layer of how do you value what you eat and the norms according to which you eat it. Now, in short, norms are shared orientations of what people define as what they should do, and values are shared orientations of what people desire to do.
Right.
Now, and then the next step is what Ed Schein says so beautifully. When the value becomes a norm, in other words, you start liking what you should do, it slips out of consciousness, I'm using his words, and becomes a basic assumption, right? Now, when do values become a norm? Because it works. The metaphor I often use is oxygen. As a baby, you go out of a non-oxygen environment, at least in terms of breathing, and you suddenly have to breathe. And if you don't breathe, you might be pinched or hit by the doctor, not too hard, to start crying, right? Why? Because the value of oxygen has to become a norm. Once you are a healthy person, the value becomes a norm, means that you forget about breathing while still you desire it. You only realize when you desire it if you come into a room without oxygen, okay? So that's why it has become a basic assumption. Now, the moment you realize that it was a basic assumption because suddenly oxygen is not given to you, it's called culture shock, okay? Culture shock is when you value this core of culture, your set of basic assumptions, which suddenly are not assumed to be normal again, right? Now that is a very nice little definition of Ed Schein. The blend we take is that we focus on the functioning of things so that values become norms. And that's why, for me, there's nothing more functional than a culture. So, example, the Dutch, where I'm from, because although I have a French mother, I was born and raised in the Netherlands. A basic assumption is that we like consensus. We like to involve people in decision making, okay? So it takes very long. But once we agree, we go for it. Now, how come? How come suddenly that we have developed these values that have become a norm? It's because we had to fight water. If you fight water, you need consensus because you cannot fight water alone. And if that works, you forget about it. There is no Dutch person that realizes that we have consensus because we had to fight water. Okay? Like there is hardly any human being that every 5 to 10 seconds think about breathing. It goes automatic because it works. Okay? Now, what Charles, my wonderful colleague Charles, we haven't mentioned him, Charles Hamden Turner, says, yeah, but these challenges come to us as dilemmas. And so what we share as human beings as a challenge is a dilemma. And then on the human level, we all want individual freedom and we all want teamwork. However, the Japanese, like you said earlier, Steve, the Japanese start with teamwork and worry about the individual, and the Americans start with individual freedom and worry about the team. So the dilemmas are human, but the way we reconcile them is cultural. Let me stop here.
I think that's a fabulous narration, Fons, because when I look at it, one sense for me is that a culture is really of cohorts wishing to survive, whether it's a man or a woman, or whether society trying to adapt to its environment, it wishes to survive. So an autonomous culture wishes to survive individually, whereas another culture might work in teams to survive through relational and collective purposes. Or one would demonstrate more masculinity principles if one sees a lot of hostility and aggression requirement in the environment, and one would be more feminine, let's say in the Scandinavian countries, where collaboration, cooperation is necessary to manage the environment around. And so I think to some extent, the cultures that get formatted over a period of time, as you very nicely said, that values become the norms, is perhaps socio-technical, techno-cultural, historical, geographical, which I also refer to as being the Kal, Desh and Patra, which is what is the existential time we live in, what is the Desha or the region which creates the context for action, and what is the human nature of that region that causes a particular kind of thinking and feeling. And that sets up automatically some default conditions of leaning towards one or the other. And you, Fons, have, thought about this 20 years ago when you came up with lenses by which you paired the world and described it. I use some of that in my book. Would you like to share and open up that whole 7 lenses?
Sure. Let me share that with, obviously you get the lack of content, so I use slides. And here we go. First of all, I made up this title. Let me go back to the title. How to resolve the dilemmas created by COVID-19 will be the examples. And with an Indian boss, oh my God, an Indian boss. A pleasure to do so, by the way. Now, culture is a way to solve problems that come to us as dilemmas. And the model you were referring to has 7, let's say, meta dilemmas, if you like, dimensions. And don't, please, I'll explain later, don't be shocked by the heaviness of the titles, but universalism versus particularism is the dilemma, if you like, in words, rules. There are cultures who go more for rules versus those who rather go for exceptions. Yeah? We have individual versus communitarian. We know this. I gave the example of the US and Japan. Neutral versus affective is about how do we deal with our emotions. Neutral cultures, like the Southern English, stiff upper lip. You have emotions, don't show them. Rather go for a good heart attack. And affective cultures, they have emotions and show them. We have, and that's my favorite, number 4 in the middle, specific versus diffuse, is, are you more analytic? Do you rip things apart for your understanding? Or do you put something in a larger whole, diffuse? So Americans tend to be analytic. You separate things. And Japanese are more holistic. You combine things in a larger whole. Yeah. And again, we'll give you many examples of this later on. We have number 5, what gives us status? In some cultures, status needs to be based on what you do, and that's called achievement culture. And those cultures where it's more given to where you're coming from by birth, male, female, young, old, not so much what you studied, but where you studied. That's called ascribed status, status given to you. Then we have, how do we organize time? Single tasking, multitasking, sequential, synchronic. And finally, how do we relate with the environment? Do we control the environment, internal control? Or is the environment controlling us, external control? Now, you might argue, can you capture the world in all these dimensions? Now, first of all, I'm just like a human being. Namely, my culture dictates what lenses I look through. And these are 7 lenses. Hofstede, another guy in culture, you can perhaps even clearly see that he does it from his lenses. To call, and Steve, I'm doing this because you quoted masculine and feminine. As an anthropologist, I'm not an anthropologist, but that's a very risky label, because the role of a man and the role of a female, of a woman, is dictated by culture very often. So then it's very risky to call it feminine or masculine, because if you look at the definitions, it's a Dutch definition of what is masculine and feminine, right? By the way, I'm not arguing that males are exactly the same as females. That's not my point, but the roles in which they play are culturally determined. The other one is power distance. No, in many cultures, you're not distant, you're very close, but there is an enormous power difference. But in the Dutch lens, you are distant when you have power difference. In many other cultures, you're very close, but there is an enormous power difference, a bit like a good father that is very close, but has an enormous So the point I'm trying to raise is be very careful with the labeling, because the labeling in itself might show your culture. Okay. Now we have taken these ones and it's a way of looking at the world, but it's not the only way. There are people who claim they have the only way of looking at the world. There is so much more needed. Yeah. Now, if you allow me, Steve, in the work we did on COVID-19, we looked at what are the dilemmas that COVID-19, the pandemic, has created. And there were 22 we found. And you say, that's a lot. And so we took the top 7 and linked them to those 7 dimensions. And the research we did, I can give you the report, by the way, through the wonderful organizers. But in a nutshell, the 7 are about the dilemma between, do you follow the rules of government or do you like flexibility? That's the dilemma number 1, universal particular. Individual freedom versus group solidarity. IQ versus EQ. I'll give examples later on. Do you go for one discipline, medical, or do you have a discussion between the disciplines to solve the problem? If you like multi-discipline versus single discipline, a dilemma. Do you go for what you do or who you are in terms of leadership? Do you go for short-term or long-term in terms of time? And do you think you can control the disease or do you go with the flow? Now, what we have done in our research is to look which countries have combined those extremes and therefore reconciled the dilemma. And they have much, but significantly much less death people by the way, excess mortality than those who have chosen. In fact, those who have chosen are the worst. Let's go for the economy. Brazil, it was a disaster. Compromise, like in the Netherlands, has not worked very well, as we're finding out today. Now, obviously, that's why we publish this work in an ebook. And I'm saying this because we're updating it every month. You learn, and who knows, you know, perhaps in 5 years' time, we look at our research and say, what a bloody nonsense. But so far, so good. So that's one point I wanted to make up front. And the other point was that dealing with dilemmas is not very much served by bipolar models. An example of a bipolar model is Myers-Briggs. If you score 80 on thinking, you score 20 on feeling. And we're so used to this crap that I said, but what the hell? Why is my thinking done at the cost of my feeling?
Fabulous.
Because if you look at the original writings of Carl Jung and everything he did before, is that the quality of thinking is depending on how you connect it to your feelings. And the quality of your feeling is dependent if you can frame it within your thinking.
Absolutely.
And the questionnaire of Myers-Briggs, MBTI, but only 3 million people fill it in every year. There's an industry of $3 billion around this crap. You have to make a choice. Are you kidding? I want, by the way, we developed it, an integrated Myers-Briggs. Namely, how do you combine the two? So you score 100 on thinking and 100 on feeling, and it makes you a beautiful person.
Fabulous.
The wonderful work of MBAs, and I have one, so I can tell you, in the Netherlands better known as mediocre but arrogant, I ask them, because I'm teaching them, what is the main reason for a company to centralize? And what is the main reason for a company to decentralize? And you recognize an MBA because they're ready with the answer before you end the question, right? And you say, oh, we centralize for control, consistency, economies of scale. And you decentralize for flexibility, being close to the customer and what have you, right? And then I invite them to say, yeah, the same question, but now first think. And they get nervous because normally that's not part of their education. Now, if you think about it, and obviously I will not challenge you here, but the only reason for centralization is decentralization. Because if you're not decentralized, there's nothing to centralize, okay? And for the very quick mind, you know the opposite holds true too, that you can only decentralize something that is central. Now, this is not a word game. Let's take our human body. Our human body, is that central or decentral? And the answer is yes. We have centralized certain functions to allow for more decentralization. So for example, the human body has centralized the information of an activity that is decentral. Now those are the two comments I wanted to give.
Fabulous.
Before we go to the model. That dilemma reconciliation needs other models, right? And if you like, because Myers-Briggs people, and I respect many of them, they say, Fons, you're right, but what we are doing with Myers-Briggs is to define your preference. And it's a bit our way of saying the dilemma between thinking and feeling is human. The way we approach the dilemma is measured by MBTI. You start with thinking, what you called, Steve, earlier, foreground and background, right?
Yes, polarity.
What is your foreground? What is your background? That's okay. But the dominance of your hand, because yeah, we know you have two hands, but one is dominant. And we say, yeah, but we are in the paradigm of clapping. And if you clap, the dominance of your hand of writing becomes irrelevant. It's about coordination, right? And that's what I wanted to throw up in the beginning.
Fabulous, Fons. And you said so much that a lot of bells ringing for me. And one of them, this whole notion of this Aristotelian logic of either or, and therefore playing itself out in the MBTI. But the MBTI type 2, you actually have the histograms on both sides. And this whole foreground and background of feeling and thinking and sensing and perception and so on, playing itself out almost like a yin yang as two sides, and therefore both seeking each other. Some of the notions we have held in at least the indigenous psychology is of the Prakriti and the Purush coming together, the Nar and Nari, of the feminine principles and the masculine principles together, the yin and yang that from Japan, the anima and the animus, and the whole notion of that actually for individuation, you need the complement and the juxtaposition of both rather than seeing it diffused and split in either or kind of a language that you say. But when I look at what you've just talked about, the whole cultural notions of splitting the world, it offers some looking at the pairs and the leanings. And therefore, to some extent, I'm caught with the fact that when you look at these 7 lenses for India, there is definitely a leaning towards some of these. For example, our leaning towards, being very bound by principles rather than a rule is a rule is a rule, and so on. And I can talk about for India what each of these, how it relates to the Indian notion itself. But I just want to end by saying one comment, which is that, and this is the point you brought about the light shining onto an ellipse or a line, is I look at what I shared in my book about the diamond model, that man is not a noun, but man's a verb. man is constantly in a state of being and becoming, and he's constantly in a state of evolution. And like water in a river, depending on the banks, which is the context of the culture or the region, he formats his behavior, similar to what Kurt Lewin talked about, to be relevant. So he can be this, in this situation, he can be that. And more importantly, Fons, I hold the belief that he is this and that, and he is more, with infinite potentiality. And therefore, it's very, for me, I find this whole definition of being very rigid and describing it into he is either extroversion or introversion, etc., etc. And as you pointed out, there's a tremendous amount of difficulty and rigidity with holding lenses that are so tightly bound together, Fons.
Very good. Steve, would you allow me to give some examples? Because I'm very keen to know your insights in what it means for India. Because what I've done is I've taken some scores. We have 140,000 people who filled in our questionnaire.
Fabulous.
And there are huge differences between the Netherlands, let's say, as a representative of the West, and India. And I would love to, and very keen to know what that means for India. So if I give you a question, and I've given this question to 140,000 people, perhaps more, because it was sometimes oral. And the question is as follows. You're riding in a car driven by a close friend of yours. Your friend is speeding, going 50, let's say, kilometers or miles an hour, where you're allowed to go 30. And your friend hits a pedestrian. You come to court and the lawyer of your friend says, don't worry, you're the only witness. Two questions. What is the right of your friend to expect you to testify to the lower figure? In other words, to lie for your friend. My friend has a definite right, some right, no right. Okay. Second question is, would you lie, yes or no? Now, I often invite people to answer this, but before doing so, I ask the question, who would like to be in this situation? And believe me,
no one.
I've done this in Bangalore, I've done this in Tokyo, I've done this in Nigeria, Lagos, I've done this in New York. And I never had a participant who said, nice situation to be in, okay? Now, Steve, I don't know if we have time to ask people, yeah, why not?
Yeah.
To answer A, B, or C by the chat box. Okay. Just, half a minute. You have the time of, in the chat box, say, is it A, B, or C, what your answer would be. And just have a look at if there is some diversity of thought about this question. Would that be a good idea?
It's already started, Fons. So 1A, 2B is already getting typed in. And we've got 2 A's and 2 B's. 1C is popped in. And a B again. So there are 3 B's. And somebody's saying it's in between A and B for India.
Okay. Good. Good.
And someone's voted C. Once again a B, and then again another C, and then B. The B seems to be more dominant.
Yeah, yeah.
Someone doesn't want to take a call, says it's very subjective, so it's very subjective.
Yeah. Now there might be people, since people are, that, and I've had that in France to start with, and they asked me the question, yes, sorry, I can't answer because what happened to the pedestrian?
Yeah. What happened to the pedestrian, or what happened to, yeah.
Yeah, and I said dead, very dead, to make it extreme. Although in the real questionnaire it was not, the results I show, it was unclear what happened to the pedestrian. And then the French person said, oh, I answered B, but then it should be A. And an American next to the French person said, what? And he said, yeah, because now my friend needs a lot of help.
Yeah.
While in the American mind, like, by the way, in the Dutch mind, it would be rather C. Why? Because there are moments that it is so serious you cannot lie. So it shows the nature of the dilemma. Yeah. And we call that universalism versus particularism. Now, don't be afraid. A universalistic answer, C, by the way, in combination with the second question, we haven't asked it here, is would you lie, yes or no? This would be no. So it's a combination, the extreme of universalism, my friend has no right, regardless of what happened to the pedestrian, and I will not lie, okay? The extreme of particularism is my friend has a definite right, and I will help by lying because that's what friends are for. And that is more the other side. Be flexible, pragmatic, there are exceptions. Now, look at the scores. Here we are. And you see that the, if you like, Protestant part of the world, from the UK to Switzerland, are between 72 and 95. Namely, my friend has no right and I will not help by lying, okay? And you go down and you meet India in orange, and it's 17, 18%. Now the risk at the top, people would say, thank you, Mr. Trompenaars. I knew people from Mozambique, Argentina, and India, they are corrupt because you can't trust them. They always help their friends. Till I did a workshop in India, and an Indian person came to me and said, Mr. Trompenaars, thank you. I knew that the Americans are corrupt, and you proved it. I said, what do you mean? You can't trust them because they won't even help their friends. Now, I'm doing this to show you the top is not better than the bottom, and the bottom is not better than because in a dilemma, you need to reconcile. And one way of reconciling is looking for integrity. So suppose your value is integrity. What would your choice be? Now, the people at the top would say, oh, if you have integrity, you don't lie. Then people from India would say, yeah, but sorry, sir, if I have integrity, I'll help my friend. How can you have it now? And all people understand that, right? Because integrity is creating wholeness through the integration of opposites. Okay? And this is what I learned in Japan. In Japan, they would say, if you have integrity, you invite your friend to tell the truth in court himself, so we can talk to the judge to lower the sentence for his courage. Now, if we look at these graphs, Steve, could you say something about what this means in terms of being an Indian boss or dealing with an Indian boss?
Thanks for that. Firstly, I think your numerical score on India is dead right. India is a culture that has for 7,000 years been hierarchical and tied across classes and castes and groups, which I would call in groups and out groups. And there's special relationship between the various classes and the caste, and what is in Indian we call the apna and the pariah, and that determines the kind of social contracts and relationships. And within the apna, there are certain obligations of looking after each other. And for instance, somebody with a ethnocentric lens may see a particular practice as being what would be described in italics as nepotism. But in India, it would be seen as, I'm doing this for my own community. That's not nepotism. I'm doing that for my own, and I'm expected to help my community in matters such as these. And therefore, one of the other elements of apna and pariah is that once you hold the boundary of what is apna, then everything outside that boundary ends up becoming the outer group, and therefore it becomes the pariah, and then one has that constant hostility in the way that is held in that sense. And I think somebody on the chat box mentioned it all depends, and talked about with wife or with a friend, and said it all depends. And I think a very important fact, Fons, is that A.R. Ramanujan, in an article said, is there an Indian way of thinking? And he confirmed that in India, we don't believe in any rule is a rule is a rule. We believe in the essential principle of what we call the dharma. And the dharma has got for all occasions. Dharma in terms of family, dharma in terms of situations, dharma in terms of a class of life, dharma with regards to, and even for a crisis, which is the apadharma. In fact, Mahatma Gandhi said to the Britishers, although he knew law, that I reject your right on me because I follow a supreme principle, which goes higher than that aspect. So in everything that I've said so far, it's very strongly particularist as versus universalism. And you'll find that a lot of Western books have got these book titles which says the rule of 3, the rule of 10, rules to live by. We don't have those rules to live by. We all have the context to live by, and the context determines what rules we follow. And I think, Fons, the rule making is left to the individual, not by a church or not by a 10 commandment, not by somebody out there, but it is a self-discovery of what is the right thing to do, depending on one's swadharma and where one is going with one's station. I hope that clarifies for India.
Oh, very much. Steve, may I ask, is this beautiful set of insights available in your book?
Absolutely. My book is all about actually surfacing and opening up the essential elements of Indianness. As it seems to, Fons, unconsciously be part. Like, you said some time back that there is some unconscious values that have become norms, and which I call social character. And there has been a large number of things that over the years has become unconsciously the kind of stuff that makes us think, feel, and act.
Oh, wonderful. Hey, Steve, may I react on the chat box? People who say it all depends, for me, is a sign of particularism. Because let's take the 100% universalist. The 100% universalist would say, I don't mind what happened to the pedestrian. I don't mind if it's a good friend or my wife. Even my wife, she cannot expect me to lie. And by the way, if I would lie, my wife would not respect me. So it doesn't depend on anything. It is all about the universal truth. And the extreme of particularism is not only the French question, what happened to the pedestrian, but in a workshop, and it still makes me laugh. There was an Italian, and he was quite serious, said, sorry, but I need to know what happened to the car. And that is more particularistic, My answer will depend on give me more information, yeah? Anyway, hey, we have 6 more to go. But before going to the next one footnote. We have looked into a free app called the COVID-19 Resilience app. I will show you a link later on because I would love the participants to complete that. And it's for free for the Dutch participants. It gives you an insight in your own resilience, namely, how good are you working with these opposites? And what do you think your country is doing with those opposites? Okay, I don't want to give too much away, but one of the dilemmas is, do you comply or are you flexible? And we call again, a metaphor of the reconciliation, the sandbox approach. And in fact, the Swedes are coming close to that. Namely, we have boundaries, don't forget, it's not complete freedom in Sweden. But within the boundaries, we give you as much freedom as possible. It's what you do with children in a sandbox. Don't go out of the sandbox. Those are the universal boundaries within which you get particular freedom. And it correlates very highly with the excess mortality, namely a negative correlation, okay? The second one is A or B. And A says the quality of life is best guaranteed by giving people as much freedom as possible versus No, you have to continuously look after your fellows.
Hmm.
Shall we go for a vote again very quickly?
All right,
Is
so
it
it's
rather
A or
for
B,
you?
and no one
A or
started
B?
typing as yet.
Yeah, in the chat box, huh?
Please start.
Yeah.
So A is the first one started. That's Nick.
A is about individual freedom.
Yeah, others, again, it's A.
And you remember Adam Smith?
Vincent is coming with A, and Sylvia, others have come in with B. Regal Cameron A, Faye with B. So I think
No C, yeah?
no C. and, and I'm from the US. Nick, B. So it's almost like a split house. I think it's
Okay, okay, but that's fine. But
Yeah.
look, if we look at national, we don't have the opportunity to do so here. But have a look at India is one of, by the way, this is not 140 countries. The lowest score I know is 9. But Japan, India, and the Netherlands, much more individualistic. This is the percentage of people. By the way, the minimum size per country is 200. 200 people filling it in. And you see that there are some surprises. Japan, you expect, India, you expect, but be careful. In India, perhaps it's more the caste or the family, while in Japan, it might be the company. So this is not telling you everything about a country. But may I invite you, Steve, to say something about the more communitarian, collective Indian person and the more individualistic Western world, and what that might mean for the Indian boss.
So, Fons, as I started saying initially, that the desire to survive creates a leaning towards self-autonomous being and taking one's own initiative and critical thinking, which is valued in one society, versus another society that values collaboration and working in a relational model. And I think India is more relational model where the self-I is seen to be subsumed in deference to the we, the me, the social me. So I am part of the family, I'm part of my culture, I'm part of my class, I'm part of a tradition, and there's almost seems to be a de-amplification of the I. So the I doesn't come out. So if you ask somebody, maybe from a Western orientation, tell me about you, he says, I'm very competent, I've got this fabulous scores on EQ and IQ. If you talk to perhaps an Indian orientation, says, I am from this place, I am from this origin, this is my religion, I come from this particular tradition, my family. So it's a relational self. It's a relational self that is clear. Now, it's very difficult, Fons, to take India and to just, unify it, because there are many Indias. And
how many languages, Steve? How many languages?
22 official languages, if you take a 100-rupee note, but there are much more than that. So if you look at India, it has to be seen through its multiplicity. And we have found in our research, and also researchers who have worked with, your work, also worked with Gert Hofstede's work, worked with the Globe studies, and worked with indigenous psychology, they have found that they have pulled out another card, another lens, which is the ethnic lens. And it's the ethnic lens of individualism, economic development, urbanization, adaptation to the market economy, the socio-techno aspects of India that create the various kinds of India which is there. And we have found that regionalism, the collectivism is regional.
Right.
So I can be a collective as a bubble for me and my family. I can expand the bubble to include the whole of Bangalore when it comes to the IPL match and RCB. I can be a large bubble when I'm at a war with a neighboring country. So I have this collapsible apna and a flatter apna, depending on convenience. And yet these bubbles that live in a bowl do not actually get mixed into one homogeneous entity, like let's say a melting pot, but they live in tolerance and coping with each other's apna, which is what I go back to for a syncretic nation that has actually celebrated 1,000 flags and yet have managed to keep a tightness around and a rigidity around its own in groups. Does that clarify in a way?
Very good, very good. May I give two examples of the reconciliation?
Yes.
Because reconciliation is particularly needed when different cultures come together. And the first one was in Shell. When I was working there, there was a group of Japanese researchers that after half a year were complaining that the whole bonus system in Shell, what very Dutch, British company, was based on the individual bonus. Cutting a long story short, to resolve this, they have said, we will give now a bonus to individuals under one criterion: who's the best team player? And we give teams the other 50% of the variable pay on the basis of what the team can show they have done to nurture individual excellence. Now that's an example of co-opetition. You individually compete to better cooperate, you cooperate to better individually compete. Right? And that's a reconciliation between individual and group.
Fantastic.
Another one is in COVID-19, group solidarity, communitarian, versus individual accountability. And again, it's still in theory, and I hope it will work in practice. At least this was the practice that hopefully will lead to results, but we don't know yet. And that is Sweden. They said, we hold individuals accountable to have solidarity with the group. And we see the same discussions now in the Netherlands. And Sweden and the Netherlands are close to the red bar, more individualistic. Not extreme like Norway and the US, but fairly much. Sweden, I saw, was not on this list, but you start with individual accountability. But the accountability is aimed at group solidarity. And that's the only way to fight COVID-19. Okay? And that is something that is done also in China, but the other way around. You start with group solidarity, which gives individuals freedom in a later stage.
Fabulous.
Now, I don't want to take too much of this time, neutral versus affective. It's about how much do you tend to show your emotions. It's not about having emotions, but about expressing them. And in view of time, I would like to be short. Have a look. The Netherlands more neutral, India more affective, more showing emotions. Any short comments on this, Steve?
Actually, India is not about neutral. It's neutral affective. It tends to hold. It tends to hold its expression, and is a restrained society. But in selective spaces, it can be very unrestrained.
Interesting. Yes. I noticed that once you are in the private bubble,
yes,
it's very affected.
Yes. Yes.
So you have to be careful also with this type of research.
Yes.
It doesn't take always that, it's the combination of things, and I'll come back to that in a second. For example, the combination of this dimension and the next one. And I would like to see a bit on, let's start with a question. And it's explaining specific versus diffuse. A boss asks you to paint his house. Answer A, dear boss, go to hell. Why? He's the boss in the company, not outside the company. And this is a private request. A diffuse culture would say, yeah, it's my boss and he or she is boss everywhere. So I need to paint the house of the boss, right? Now, let me explain specific and diffuse a little. Specific is shareholder value. Diffuse is stakeholder value, as an example. Specific is you focus on the economy. Diffuse is you focus on health. Okay? Specific is analytic. Diffuse is holistic. You see enormous differences. In the Netherlands, 92% would say, dear boss, go to hell. Now, how does specificity show? for example, in the directness of speech. You separate private from public, private from being a boss in the company and outside. And now, don't you love this core? One of the most diffuse cultures is India, by the way, with China and Kuwait. Why? Because everything is mixed. And I don't know if you could say something more about that, Steve. And then after you, I will give the dilemma between obviously the economy and the world of health as an example. If you combine the two, and I'll give some examples, you're in great shape.
So I
Please,
think
Fons,
the workplace is often referred to as the kutumb or the parivar or the family, and is a projection from the karta, who's the head of the Indian family. And there is a complete transposition of the affiliative processes from the family systems and the sociological elements back into the workplace itself, and all the projection and introjection as a resultant of that. And therefore, the overlaps and the interlaps between what is work and what is not tight. And therefore, the boss can have a discussion about your wife, your children, your school, invite you to his parties, and there is very little that is held in terms of work life and personal life and private life, and so on and so forth. Now, having said that, it also is a very closed system because relationships are so tight and so closed. You can only enter into one apna cohort through an introduction of someone who's respected, rather than just formal, by way of performance or by way of merit. So those kinds of elements come out with regards to even our language. When we say, no worries, sir, it'll get done, or we nod our head in agreement, although we know there's going to be problems, it simply means that the language is often played down to be able to be accommodative without betraying one's feeling, or also being respectful and being polite. Thoughts.
Very, very, very nice. If you don't mind, I'll give the health versus economy. It's a cultural thing. Specific cultures like the US would tend to go for shareholder value first and then worry about the rest. Diffuse cultures like most of Asia start with health and then worry about the economy. But those who combine the two are in great shape. So if you take China, they have combined the two. They have said, but we start, and sometimes dilemma reconciliation, you start with your strong suit, namely, we are diffuse and health comes first. And then automatically we are great again in the economy, right? Now, a good example in the Netherlands is that G-Star, at a certain moment, which is a Dutch company, denim, many things made in India, by the way, that G-Star said, how can we combine health with the economy? And within a week, they produced 100,000 fashionable face masks. Nice. They sold the 100,000 in one day for 60 euros a piece, washable, high quality. So they made money out of health. They contributed to health and made a profit on top. I wish most governments would argue like that.
Fabulous.
Then obviously some start with the economy and others start with health, as long as you have in mind what can it do with the opposite.
Fabulous. Fabulous. Fabulous.
And it's a simple example, rather than we have to make a choice. Choices in a dilemma are very stupid.
Fabulous.
In view of time, Steve, I would like to go to what gives people status. You remember, achievement is what you do versus ascription, who you are. And what we have found in the scoring of it is that in India, it's more ascription, and the caste system, I think, is a very obvious example.
Yes.
In the Netherlands, it's not the top scorer, but more towards achievement. US, by far, achievement-oriented. You cannot even talk about Are you male, female, young, old? It's none of your business. Yeah. It is about my output, while the bottom scores are about your input. And the only thing I want to say about COVID-19 is that it is shown that the type of leadership that combines top-down, which is ascribed status, with bottom-up, which is achieve status, and you can challenge the ideas of the leader, but because it's based on your output. That servant leadership, which is a very Gandhi type of idea, it's a very Mandela type of idea, it's a very Hinduist thought. The reconciliation of top-down and bottom-up is servant leadership, leads to much less death by the COVID-19 than for those who go top-down. Very often in crisis, you need top-down management. Nonsense. Neither bottom-up, because it takes too long. How do you combine top-down and bottom-up? You listen carefully, and then you're decisive. That type of leadership was number 2 correlation with the excess number of deaths negatively. So that's what I wanted to say about the results of our research.
And Fons, while validating your study, I just wanted to bring in, we won't have time to go into it, which is that there is in this whole world of achievement, there is an equalization and equality, whereas the Indian region has the notion of equity. Like all 5 fingers are not the same, and it is possible to gift members in the community differently, and it's a gifting society versus just meritocracy for its own sake. And that sets a lot of issues with a Western-based organization methodology with an Indian setting of gifting and bestowing and the way it is held, and therefore the dharam sankatas. We call polarities and contradictions dharam sankatas, which is a way of living with contradictions that are inherent in living.
Very good. A beautiful example, Steve, I think in France. Oh, people say once you went to the Grandes Écoles, École Polytechnique, you have a lot of status and you don't have to work anymore. On the contrary, because you have so much status, people expect a lot from you.
Yeah.
Right? And I think it's the same in India.
Yeah.
The responsibility you feel is even bigger because you're chosen.
Yeah, and what since you, and because of the station you are at life, one is more lenient or more harsh in the way you are seen with regards to your actions.
Right. Wonderful.
You know, Fons, I'm just thinking, we've got about 7 minutes left on this call, and we have 2 choices. We'll never be able to finish the runway on the remaining 3.
Steve, let me just do, I promise you in 2 minutes.
Okay.
And it is about how do we measure sequential with synchronic. We ask people to draw 3 circles.
Yeah.
We look at not only the size, are you more future-oriented or past-oriented, but also are you separate or are you overlapping? So the US is more separate, more sequential, and Germany is more, and like Japan, 50% of Japan concentric circles, right? And we have looked in this about short-term and long-term, and the reconciliation leads to less death. And the final one is, have a look. What happens to me is my own doing. And sometimes that's called locus of internal control versus external control. Are you outer directed, B, or inner directed, A? And there are huge differences. The Dutch are more inner directed. We do it ourselves. And India is more keen to look at the outside. Why I wanted to show this in our COVID-19 research, the top correlation of the excess mortality was linked to how do you combine things you learn from things outside of your culture, and combine it with things you have done inside your culture, leads to less number of deaths. And I want to show at the very end ways of downloading the research and especially your resilience test, because that would do me a great pleasure to get more people from the world to fill it in. Steve,
Super.
some comments on that?
But two comments on this. One is that we are a society that does not, unlike a Western orientation, look at physiological and material, but we also bring in the metaphysical. Call it spiritual if you wish, but we do believe that we are part of pattern generation and everything is connected with each other. And we do believe at an existential level, many of the things are destined to be, and there's a certain level to which you can bring in the awe, but there's a wind that blows on your sail, and that's an Indian orientation of Kismat and that orientation. And then on the other aspect of time, while the Western orientation is about sequential, the ballet dance, the flats and the highs in music, ours is about circular music, about constantly the Trimurti of creation, destruction, and consolidation, and a belief that we will have thousands of lives. And it's all about embellishment, and it's all about rags, and you can clearly see life. And we have a tremendous need to go back to the future, to the past, to recast our future. And I see the Western world going into sci-fi and Star Wars to reposition their anxiety about the present. So it's just a cultural context of, do I lean on my past or do I lean on my future to release me of the tensions that I hold for my present.
Wonderful, wonderful.
Hmm?
Hey, so, Steve, shall we open up for some questions?
Yes, of course, and we haven't given them much time. So it's 3 minutes, and all right, let's go with the questions, please. And sorry about being squeezed on time. Yeah. Who wants to go first?
You can also type them in. Huh?
Yeah, that is there a way that they can actually voice it?
We would have to nominate individuals as panelists. I don't know that time will allow for it, unfortunately. So I know we had the questions about the slides being shared. So typically we'll have that available on the blog post.
Yeah, and may I just at least leave this so people can download, and also there is
and fill it up. Yeah.
The coronavirus resilience test. It's for free, but it adds to our research, and that would be wonderful if you would just fill it in yourself. But anyway, that's a footnote. But are there burning questions, or were Steve and I so fantastically clear?
I think Vanessa was trying to warn us that we may not have time to answer questions. So what we could do, Fons, is to get some quick reflections and feedback on our session. So if I may request each one of you to just write in one word, a phrase, to share with us how you've experienced the last 90 minutes. So would you please type in your reflections, observations, feedback. So Nick says enlightening, Kalpana engaging, value investment of time,
and the rest were already gone.
That's also great information. Too heavy a subject to grasp everything. Your views on the trend to go to lockdowns everywhere, compromise or reconciliation, deep and needs great introspection, deep thoughts. And so in a sense, I get the sense, Fons, that people found value for the time that they spent. There wasn't a dilemma about being here, at least for this session, Fons. Would you like to say a few words as you wind down, Fons?
Yes, Steve. I just glanced because it's just out at your book. You need to read the book of Steve, and I mean that. There is so much good stuff in there, and I really appreciate working with you, Steve. And also, Nessa, thank you for your hosting. You do an excellent job, and you can see you enjoy it.
Thank you. I do. I've said it in past webinars for this series. I consider it such a privilege to be in the spot that I'm in. I get to connect with so many wonderful people, both in our audience and then our phenomenal speakers. And I get the last word, which is also fun.
Very good.
I just want to say 30 seconds before I hand it back to you, Vanessa. I think, Fons, when I first met you 15, 20 years back, you have always been a guru, a global guru, someone who reflected and shone the light on cultures across. I remember The Pedestrian, Who Killed the Pedestrian, the book. I read that from cover to cover, and just being here with you and holding this conversation with you has been tremendous in the way in which you've graced it, allowed me presence, allowed me space. I am deeply grateful for this dialogue with you, Fons.
But great pleasure, and it's very reciprocal.
Wonderful.
And
gentlemen, thank you. Thank you. Oh gosh, Steve, I didn't mean to cut you off. I apologize.
No, I was handing it back to you.
My eager American self can't help it.
No.
Gentlemen, it absolutely just a privilege. This was amazing. We're right at time, so I'm going to be very brief. So many great awarenesses and reminders shared here. I'm always looking to be very conscious of my belief systems and where they've come from. And there are a couple things that I just noticed that had come up for me while you were talking, and just understanding how culture has defined our roles and how we show up and how that incorporates our identity. And so I think just that rinse and repeat of looking at that and asking why, I think this was, at a very, very high level, just a really great reminder to continue to look at our lenses and understand where they came from. So, and I love your chemistry, by the way, gentlemen, like you guys, it's seamless. It's seamless. It's like you both are at the same coffee table with us. So I don't want us to run over too much on time. I'm grateful for you guys. I'm so glad to know you. Thank you for letting me help hold the space. And thank you for your brilliant insights. This was absolutely wonderful. I wish you all the very best. And again, thank you everybody for joining us. Continue the conversation on our LinkedIn group, and stay tuned. A couple hours, we have a little bit more for you. So thank you again, everybody. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you, Vanessa. Thank
You're
you,
welcome.
Fons. Thank you,
pleasure.
everyone, for joining us. Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.